Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome back to A House Divided, coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago. If it's on our shelves, it's history. I'm your host for the day. My name is Bjorn Skaptason, and I am here with Alan C. Guelzo, coming to you from his library in Gettysburg or Pennsylvania?
Paoli, Pennsylvania.
Paoli, Pennsylvania. Excellent. Excellent. We're going to get to that in just a minute. I want to know a little bit about that library. I love backgrounds on these Zoom discussions. But first, for the folks at home, again, we are coming to you from Abraham Lincoln Bookshop in Chicago, and you are watching this, as I'm sure you know, live stream over your Facebook account, or watching it from our Facebook account. That means you can participate in the conversation. And you can do that by asking questions or making comments in the comments section of the live stream. I'm going to monitor that and check in on that. And if you have any questions there, I will share them with Professor Guelzo. And if you have any comments to make, you can make those too. Whether or not they get shared live depends entirely on whether they're nice comments. But we have a topic today that elicits commentary. I've seen some of it recently in the public sphere. But first of all, let me show you the book. The book is Robert E. Lee, A Life by Alan C. Guelzo, a new biography of Robert E. Lee. It comes to us from Alfred A. Knopf, and we thank them for publishing the book and helping Alan get on this program with us. We are offering the book to you in the first edition, 588 pages, illustrations and maps, so wonderful illustrated end pages with Stratford there. I love when a publisher goes all in on the end pages. That's always great as far as I'm concerned. So first, let me tell you folks at home a little bit about Alan Guelzo, and then we will move on to discussing the book. Alan C. Guelzo is a senior research scholar at the Council of Humanities at Princeton University and director of the James Madison Program's Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship. He's the author of, well, I wrote several books. I'm not sure several is the word to describe it. But among my favorite works from Alan Guelzo are Gettysburg, The Last Invasion, The Lincoln-Douglas Debates, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, The End of Slavery in America, Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, Abraham Lincoln is a Man of Ideas. These are all books that I have on my bookshelf at home. And now you can also get Robert E. Lee, A Life. The three-time recipient of the Lincoln Prize, and also the recipient of the Guggenheim Lehrman Prize for Military History. Welcome to the show, Alan C. Guelzo.
Well, thank you, Bjorn. Once again, it is a treat to be in connection with the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, which is a source of pilgrimage for all Lincolnians and anyone who wants to know about Lincoln, learn about Lincoln, read about Lincoln. There's simply no escaping that necessary trip to the Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. I'm glad to have made it many times. I'm glad to be virtually making it today.
Oh, thank you very much. And I might add, it is a place where you're perfectly welcome if what you want to do is criticize Abraham Lincoln or learn more about any part of history. We are not necessarily the carriers of the flame, if you want to put it that way. What we find wonderful about collecting books and about studying history is the fascination of history. And the same thing as our readers say. So with that in mind, let's talk about this new book about Robert E. Lee. Like I said, this is a fellow that I've heard in the news recently. And in fact, I have heard and read out there on the internet the phrase, "Why another Lee biography?" And for your first question, and this comes from the book, Apparently in 2014 or thereabout, you asked yourself the question when you were in the middle of writing this book. Tell us the story of how you came to the conclusion, yes, it's necessary, more necessary now than ever, for people to get a new look at Robert E. Lee.
Well, two things were in my mind back in 2013 and 2014. I had just published Gettysburg, The Last Invasion. That had been out, and we did a lot of work with that over the summer, which was the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So the question comes to my mind, as it would come to the mind of anyone who has the instinct to write, what next? To what should one turn one's attention? And my mind gravitated toward Lee, basically for two reasons. All the titles of the books that you mentioned earlier were in some way connected to Abraham Lincoln. And that's really where I have hung my hat for many years. And probably will hang my hat yet again as we move forward. But the question was in my mind, what would the Civil War look like from the other end of the telescope? And I've looked at the landscape of the Civil War now for many years through, shall we say, the Lincolnian end of the telescope.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the other end? Who would you find at the other end? And what would it look like when you looked through it? Well, the person at the other end, most obviously, would be Robert Edward Lee. So what would the Civil War look like? This war I have written about, this conflict I have written about so much, what would it look like from the perspective of the man who was almost the Confederacy personified by the end of the war, and that is Robert E. Lee? So that was one question. Second question in my mind had more of an edge to it, and that is this: how do you write the biography of someone who commits treason? I don't use the word lightly. When I look at Robert E. Lee, I have to look at him from a constitutional point of view, and the constitutional definition of treason, which is making war against the United States and giving aid and comfort to its enemies. I don't really have an easy way of shaving off the edges of Robert E. Lee in some way that he wouldn't fit that. I'm afraid that in fact he does, and that what he was guilty of was, in fact, treason. And I really mean it when I say I don't take that lightly. My father was a professional soldier. He took the oath, protect, defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. My son, who's a serving Army officer, took that oath. When I became a member of the National Council for the Humanities in 2006, I took that oath. So I take that seriously. Lee took a similar oath, but he went in a very different direction. What is it like to write the biography of somebody like that? If you're writing about Abraham Lincoln, then you're writing about someone who, almost without exception, people will acknowledge as a great man. They may argue over some aspects of the greatness, but a great man. But Robert E. Lee is different. Robert E. Lee represents what I like to call difficult biography, because there are some biographies, or at least the subjects of some biographies, which are difficult to write about. How do you write a biography about Neville Chamberlain? You're always dealing with the question, why didn't he really see what was going on in Germany in the 1930s? Why did he not do what we might have wished he would have done? Even Winston Churchill, who did see what Chamberlain did not want to see, even Winston Churchill has his difficult moments, because, well, there's the Dardanelles, there's Norway, there's Gandhi in India. There are moments when Winston Churchill presents difficulty to biographers. What is it like then to write difficult biography? And that had a sort of charm for me, because it set out a challenge. And that was what I wanted to meet, was a particular challenge in writing biography. And as it developed, there was one other challenge too. There were a number of other people I could quite possibly have written about. I could have turned my attention to writing about Grant. I could have turned my attention to writing about Sherman. They got their difficult moments for sure. I could have written about William Stark Rosecrans. There's some real difficulty.
Yeah.
One of the difficulties is that, well, in the last 35 years, there have been 10 freestanding biographies of Grant.
Yep.
Even William Tecumseh Sherman has
Mhm.
had 9 of them. Uh, After a while, are you really not just driving the nail through the board? But
Mhm.
Robert E. Lee, there the biographies become much more sparse. The last
Right.
really important biography, single volume biography of Lee to appear, was
Mhm.
Emery Thomas in 1995. Now, there've
Yeah.
been some
That's a
smaller stuff.
generation ago in
Yeah,
academic and
yeah.
scholarly years. Yeah.
And a great book, a
Mhm.
great book. But apart from some comparatively small studies, again, fine studies on their own terms, but small
Mhm.
scale, why was Lee not the subject of the kind of attention that Grant and Sherman and these others were?
Mhm.
And as I pushed into this, I found out, all right, why that was the case. It's not difficult to write biography of Grant or Sherman because, for one thing, look, we've got the papers of Ulysses Simpson Grant, that great series,
Yes.
27 volumes.
Mhm.
There, it's all there.
Mhm.
And it's not, you don't have to go running around trying to track down all kinds of Grant material.
You can go to
Like,
Mississippi and visit the
sure.
library. Oh, yeah. There's not a place
But
like that for Lee.
likewise for Abraham Lincoln, you've got the
Mhm.
Basler collected works, you've got the ongoing project of the papers of Abraham Lincoln. You've even got collected writings of Andrew Johnson and Jefferson Davis.
Mhm.
But Lee, no.
Right.
Why? And
Mhm.
the basic answer is because Lee's papers, and believe me, he was a compulsive letter writer.
Right.
He must have written between 6,000 and 8,000 letters in his lifetime. His papers are scattered, many of them in penny packets, all across the continent. I have tracked down Lee material from the Morgan Library in New York City to the Huntington Library in San Marino and all kinds of places in between. And trying to track these letters down, trying to identify sources for them, that was a labor in and of itself. I had to create what I called a catalog of Lee letters. And what this was, it was a single spaced, single entry, 104 pages worth of descriptions of Lee letters.
Okay.
And some of them are trivial, some of them have more significance to them, but you've got to track them down, where the sources are, and find out where they are. And then on top of it, a great deal of Lee material, surprisingly enough, is still in private hands
Right.
and pops up from time to time on auction sites like eBay. And I actually had 2 people who like to keep their eye on auction sites like that. I had two friends who would signal me when a Lee letter would pop up on one of these sites.
Mhm.
I wasn't going to buy it. I'm
Right. But you can
sorry.
use it.
Right. I don't. I'm sorry. I don't have those resources.
Right.
But if the auction site, for instance, has the transcription of the letter, that's what I wanted.
Exactly.
But
Well,
you
I
had,
want, okay, then I
yeah, you
want to
had to keep
jump
your eye
into
open
this.
for that. Yeah.
I want to jump into this topic right now rather than even, I have all these plans, but they can go awry. I want to jump into the topic of the letter writing. Compulsive letter writing, well, that's a phrase you put in the
Yeah.
book. And so one thing I'd like to get your opinion about, having looked at his letters, and you mentioned it, he writes 3, 4, 5 letters a day. So when you get these letters, you're going to see several of them that have the same date, right?
Yes, that's true.
So what did that help you? How did that help you get inside his head when now you know that he says this to this person and that to that person, but he says it on the same day? It's the next sheet of paper that he pulled over. Did that change the way you looked at those topics when you read them?
Occasionally.
Okay.
And I say occasionally because Lee is not a profound letter writer.
Okay.
He is interested in communicating with family and friends. And sometimes it just doesn't rise beyond the level of ordinary communication with friends, bringing you up to speed on this. So-and-so is doing that. I'm here in Texas and I'm doing this, that, and the other. On the other hand, there are some moments when it is important to put these things side by side.
Mhm.
And that's especially the case when we look at the decision that Lee makes in 1861.
Yeah.
Because there he does write multiple letters, but they are multiple letters about the decision that he has come to. And that is about not accepting field command of federal forces that might be used to suppress secession. Because, as he explains, I cannot raise my hand against my native state. I cannot draw my sword against my native state, which is Virginia. And he has to make that case to several important individuals, not the least of which is the man who was something of a father figure for him, Winfield Scott.
Mhm.
Those are moments when you can compare these letters and you watch how the language is deployed, you watch how it changes, and there you start to learn interesting things about the man.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's jump in a little bit to let's jump into the way I wanted to frame this conversation. And as I mentioned to you before, I think of these events, these interviews, as being similar to a decent paper that an undergraduate writes. Please make it about one thing, and maybe have three
Right.
illustrative points. And so, but when I look at this book you've written, I see two things that are new that I think we have to cover if we're going to explain to our customers, to the folks out there, why they're getting a new book, something that is totally unlike Emery Thomas, who also wrote an excellent biography. First is the first chapters of the book that really use these letters to understand Robert E. Lee, where he came from, the family he came from, and how that affected the growth of his character. A second thing would be the arc of our memory of Lee, which you cover in the epilogue chapter, of talking about all the books that have been written about Lee. What do we think of Lee? Well, that takes care of two of our things without discussing the American Civil War.
That's true.
So I want folks at home to know right up front, the war, as described in this book, is well covered. Professor Guelzo is an excellent storyteller, and all of those stories that you think there's new stuff and all that. And we're going to talk about some of it, but I think that this book plows some serious new ground in these other two areas, and I want to make sure we cover them in this conversation. So first, let's get an idea of Robert E. Lee has been portrayed as an absolute, straightforward, simple character by previous biographers. Not a simpleton, but that guy, Freeman, says, there's nothing else to learn about him. And then he wrote 4 volumes,
right,
and then 3 volumes of military history to follow that. But when you look at his early years, you realize there's so much more that is so complex, especially with that hereditary background. It's as if everybody in the country thought it must be an awesome thing to be the son of Lighthorse Harry Lee. And Robert E. Lee was the only person that took exception. Tell us about that relationship, the relationship with the dead father, the absent father.
Right. We often think of the Lees of Virginia as being this wonderful, aristocratic, chivalric family. And to a certain extent, the Lees were, if we're thinking of Richard Henry Lee, of Francis Lightfoot Lee, of Arthur Lee, of William Lee, that family whom John Adams described as a band of brothers in making the revolution. I mean, Francis Lightfoot Lee and Richard Henry Lee were part of the Continental Congress, and it's Richard Henry Lee's motion for independence around which Thomas Jefferson's famous declaration is written.
Mm-hmm.
Robert E. Lee was only tangentially related to them. His father, Harry Lee, Lighthorse Harry Lee, was part of what you would almost want to call the cadet branch of the family, from around Leesburg. Again, Northern Virginia, but still not in the mainstream of the Lee family, which was centered around the great estate that Thomas Lee built in the 1730s on the Northern Neck, Stratford Hall.
Yes.
Again, on the end papers of the book. Robert E. Lee is the son of the second marriage of Lighthorse Harry Lee, and thereby hangs what I think is an enormously significant tale. Lighthorse Harry Lee graduates from Princeton in 1771. He would probably have become a lawyer, but instead the revolution comes along. He joins the revolutionary cause, and he becomes quite a cause celeb of him on his own as a leader of cavalry. Certainly he becomes one of that circle of young men whom Washington almost adopted as his honorary sons. People like the Marquis de Lafayette, like Alexander Hamilton, like John Lawrence. Harry Lee is part of that. And Harry carves out a terrific career as a commander of light cavalry in the Revolution. So much so that he is able to win the hand of his cousin, Matilda Lee, who is the heiress of Stratford. And by marrying Matilda, he thereby becomes, you might say, mainstream in the Lee family. Alas, that doesn't last for terribly long. After the Revolution, people like Washington, other revolutionary generals, set their minds to how they could make their fortunes from the American future. For Washington, the advice was always invest in land in the West, invest in land in the West. We're going to build the Baltimore Canal or the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, and it's going to connect to the Ohio River and then to the Mississippi, and we'll all become wealthy. Well, that didn't happen, but that didn't persuade Lighthorse Harry. Lighthorse Harry had a gift for bad investments. He put huge amounts of money into land that never returned a dime. He had the Midas touch in reverse. Everything turned to lead. I'll tell you, Bjorn, if Lighthorse Harry was alive today, he would be investing in ski resorts in Bangladesh. and it ruined him. It ruined him financially. Matilda Lee dies, leaves him with two children, Harry IV and Lucy. Harry then remarries, as if to recoup his fortunes, into the Carters of Virginia.
Right.
So he marries Anne Hill Carter, and you think, all right, now he's back in the saddle. By that point, he'd acquired such a reputation that Anne's father wrote all kinds of stipulations into any possible settlement that Harry Lee might enjoy from marrying his daughter. That didn't restrain Harry. He burned through her cash too, and finally wound up in debtor's prison. It was such a disgusting, embarrassing, and humiliating thing that Anne Carter Lee finally said, enough with Stratford Hall. This has been nothing but a source of embarrassment. We're moving to more humble quarters. So they moved to Alexandria.
Yeah.
Well, Lighthorse Harry just can't stop putting his foot into it. Politically, he's a Federalist. He goes to Baltimore. He gets beaten nearly to death by an anti-Federalist mob in Baltimore at the outset of the War of 1812. And at that point, he leaves. He simply goes to the West Indies. He's going to get away from his creditors. He's going to get away from his harassers. Robert Lee is the offspring of this second marriage. He has two older brothers. He has two sisters. Robert is 6 years old when his father takes off for the West Indies. He never sees him again. Lighthorse Harry made an effort to get back to the United States in 1818. He made landfall in Georgia, lived for 2 weeks. He was dying of cancer anyway, and dies, is buried there. Basically, Robert Lee grows up fatherless. And there is no pain, there is no trauma more severe in the catalog of human woes than the loss of a parent before the onset of adolescence. And that loss is something that Robert Lee carries around with him all of his life. And it sparks three things in the creation of his character. You know, it's a funny thing. People are always introducing him as the son of Lighthorse Harry Lee. Every place he goes, the son of Lighthorse Harry Lee. Robert never refers, in all of that voluminous correspondence, never refers to his father, to Lighthorse Harry Lee, until later in 1861, when he finally comes into his own as General Lee, when he can finally cope with his father. Before that, it's silence, which is peculiar in and of itself. This, I think, generates three responses in Robert Lee as he develops. One is perfectionism, and I'd almost call this redemptive perfectionism. He is going to take upon himself the redemption of the Lee name, and he's going to do it by living in exactly the way Lighthorse Harry did not. He is going to live in the most perfect, unspotted, and unsullied fashion.
Right.
The second thing he is going to want is security, which of course he didn't have from Lighthorse Harry. And the third thing he's going to want is independence. He does not want to be dependent on the reputation of a Lighthorse Harry. He wants to stand on his own. And those three things, Bjorn, those three things, that desire for perfection, that desire for security, that desire for independence, these are the things that drive him. These are the things that show up in the letters. These are the things that show up in his conduct as a cadet at West Point, as an officer in the Corps of Engineers, and even as the famous Confederate general. Those become the three stars that he steers by. Right.
And so I don't need you to actually, get into Freeman on this, but Freeman looks at those same things and think, well, there's nothing to say here because it's just his character. He's perfect because he's perfect. And you're making the point, he not only is he not perfect, his gravitas, it's a performance. There's a reason to do this. It's part of a project.
And it's aggravated by the fact that, remember I said, Lighthorse Harry had married first his cousin Matilda and had two children from that. One of those children, who is, technically speaking, Robert Edward Lee's older half-brother, Harry IV. Harry IV becomes the master of Stratford. He marries, and then the woman whom he marries, he seduces her sister. And not only seduces her sister, but in fact invades trust funds that he was the trustee for. Well, of course, that means he's going to lose control of Stratford. And in fact, the embarrassment is so great that he leaves the United States. He and his wife leave the United States completely, relocate to France, and that's where Harry dies. Now, this Harry Lee acquires the nickname Black Horse Harry Lee. It was him to say Lighthorse Harry was bad, but his oldest son was worse. That's the burden Robert Lee has to carry around with him. He's got a reputation. The Lee family has got this reputation as being incorrigibles, as being people you can't trust, as being bruised reeds whom, if you lean on them, will collapse underneath you. And that shows up in a very dramatic way when Lee marries. Robert Lee marries Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the only daughter.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Because I want to share something with the folks at home. I should have made a digital copy of this, but there they are, pictures of Mary and Robert, and they're both signed. And you told me before we started that Robert E. Lee spent a lot of time at Washington and Lee signing those cards of deed.
Multitude of requests. He had to order those CDVs by the hundred, and he would spend time in his office signing them, and then people who had written to him asking for that, put it in a letter, send it off.
But then again, you were getting to the point that his relationship with Mary Custis Lee, again, is part of this project of rehabilitating the Lees. Am I right about that?
Exactly, because he marries Mary Custis in 1831. And in marrying Mary Custis, you have to bear in mind, he has married into one of the most historically significant families in Virginia, if not the nation, because Mary Custis Lee's father is George Washington Parke Custis. He is the step-grandson of George Washington. He is literally the grandson of Martha Washington. But as such, George Washington Parke Custis was considered to be the man who was the great remembrancer, the great billboard of the memory of George Washington. Whenever there was any big event going on in the Capitol, you could be sure that George Washington Parke Custis would be invited, almost as though he was the embodiment of George Washington. And he builds on a bluff overlooking the Potomac and overlooking the Capitol, this great estate, Arlington. Lee courts Mary Anna Randolph Custis, and they marry in 1831. But the process of moving towards that is kind of touchy, because George Washington Parke Custis delays and delays and delays giving his approval to the marriage. And you have to think that he's dragging his heels because he's not entirely sure if he wants his only child married to a Lee. Now eventually he'll give his consent. But this shows up after Custis dies in 1857. Because when George Washington Parke Custis dies, he leaves a will of which Robert E. Lee is to be the executor as his son-in-law. But he cuts Robert Lee out of the will almost completely. All that Robert inherits are 2 town lots in the District of Columbia. Arlington? Arlington goes to Lee's oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee. Mary gets a life interest in the property at Arlington. She can stay there as long as she lives. But Robert disappears from the will, except for the fact that old man Custis expected him to be the executor of it. It's so scandalous that Lee's son, George Washington Custis Lee, actually offers to his father, says, I'll sign the property over to you. But Robert Lee is going to do things entirely by the book. He is going to be entirely straightforward and honorable. He is going to redeem any kind of reputation that would suggest he had been looking to inherit this property just for himself. So he tells Custis, no, your grandfather's wishes were that the property should go to you, and it's going to go to you. And what's more, I'm going to put every effort into making Arlington back. I'm going to put Arlington back to economic prosperity and profitability, which it was not under old Custis. Old Custis was a nice old man, but he was something of he was an amiable dunce.
Okay.
And he just, he couldn't manage anything. I don't think he could have passed a kidney stone on his own terms. But Lee is going to determine to make Arlington profitable again for the benefit of his son. So again, all right, perfectionism. All right, he's going to do the perfect thing, especially by his father-in-law and his father-in-law's estate. He marries Mary Custis because he wants independence. The problem is that the independence is going to come at the price of security, because his in-laws are always badgering him all through the years. Resign from the army, come and live at Arlington permanently. Well, of course, what they wanted him to do was to become the overseer and manager of Arlington. That was not what Robert E. Lee wanted in life. He wanted independence. You see, the great problem here is that Lee is torn between these 3 conflicting values. Perfectionism, independence, security, they don't always blend together very well. Someone can be very independent and wind up being very insecure. Someone can get security, but at the price of independence, much less the price of perfection. Trying to make that algorithm work is Lee's labor of a lifetime.
Right. And this stewardship of Arlington, and I think perhaps when we think about Lee, we don't recognize it's a stewardship. We still think of Arlington as being his. It's not.
Right.
Except he has to It's not his, and he has to deal with it. He has to manage it, which certainly brings us to one of the specific episodes of abusive behavior and temper that comes out in the life of Robert E. Lee that you're talking about that previous biographers do not. The Marble Man does not lose his temper. He maybe raises an eyebrow at Jeb Stuart, and then that becomes the worst thing that Jeb Stuart ever. No, this is a man with a violent temper. And it comes out here at Arlington. And tell us about that when he's dealing with the enslaved people that live there that feel like they have the right to be free.
When old George Washington Parke Custis died in 1857, among the enormously confusing provisions of his will was the stipulation that the slaves at Arlington and the two other Custis properties down on the Pamunkey River, White House and Romancoke, the slaves, which amount to about 190 people, are to be emancipated in not less than 5 years. Or not, I'm sorry, not more than 5 years. In other words, by the end of 1862.
Yeah.
However, before that emancipation is to take place, 4 legacies are to be paid to Lee's daughters. In other words, old Custis's granddaughters, legacies of $10,000 each. Well, Arlington was in no condition to generate those legacies at that point. Neither were the other properties. So Robert E. Lee, Mr. Engineer, is going to have to go to work to make Arlington profitable, generate the legacies, then emancipate the slaves, then finally be able to say, all right, I've done my duty as executor of the will. The slaves had a totally different viewpoint on this. Mm-hmm. When they understood that there was a provision for emancipation in old Custis's will, they assumed that that meant right now. Mm-hmm. So that when Robert Lee turns around and says, no, not right now, and not until we make this property profitable, their response was, well, that's your problem, not ours. Mm-hmm. And he tries to behave as though he's a good Corps of Engineer person. He starts giving orders, and he wants those orders carried out. The response of the slaves was to resist, and in some cases, to run away. 3 runaways departed the property and were captured in Westminster, Maryland, and were brought back. And Lee takes this personally, because what else are runaway slaves doing? They are preventing him from providing these legacies for his daughters. They are preventing him from doing the honorable thing as the executor of the estate. So he queries them. He's very angry. He queries them. Why did you run away? Why did you think you could do this? And their response was, because we consider that we're as free as you are. Ooh, not perhaps the best choice of words under the circumstances, because at that point, Lee tells the Arlington overseer, lay it on with a whip, which the overseer refuses to do. And then Lee turns to the constable, the Arlington constable who had brought the 3 slaves back. And Lee tells him, lay it on, which he does. And by some accounts, Lee actually takes the whip in his own hands and uses it himself, 2 men and a woman. And afterwards, it is a very, very peculiar environment, because word of this leaks out. There were lots of abolitionists over in the district who were only too happy to hear and retell stories of violence this way. And an account of this makes it into the New York Tribune. It's a tremendous embarrassment for Lee for 2 reasons. One is he didn't like appearing in print. Secondly, he didn't like the Lee that he read about there. A Lee of violent temper, a Lee of uncontrollable passion. That was not the Lee he was trying to be. Mm-hmm. He writes to his son Custis, and he says, you've probably read about this incident in the New York papers. Your grandfather, he said, has left me an unpleasant legacy. It was as though he looked back on what he had done and was even horrified himself at his own loss of control.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is, and this came to me at one odd moment, one of the things that made the reputation of Lighthorse Harry Lee during the Revolution was the way he dealt with a deserter from the Continental Army who had been recaptured. He had the man's head cut off and stuck on a post as a warning to others. This was so severe that even George Washington upbraided Lighthorse Harry Lee for just, that was just over the line. So when Lee says, your grandfather has left an unpleasant legacy, which grandfather was he talking about?
Yeah.
Custis
Mhm.
or Lighthorse Harry?
Mhm.
And Lee, it is a sore point. It's a sore point for a number of Lee biographers. Southall Freeman almost wants to try to make it disappear. The
Mhm.
whole business is relegated to an appendix, and he wants to qualify it out of existence. I don't think you can do that.
Yeah.
I don't think you should, because in a way, that moment of angry breakthrough, there's the passion for perfectionism.
Mhm.
Striding forth. You are going to do what I say you do, and you're going to do it perfectly. And if you don't, I will punish you. It's of a piece with things you find in letters he writes to his children. He's not cruel in these letters, mind you, but in
Mhm.
these letters, it's always I expect you will come up to this point. I expect you will do this. If you don't do this, you will harm your father. I will take this so personally.
Mhm.
Even during the Civil War, there's a marvelous letter that he writes, marvelous for what it reveals, not marvelous in its content, that he writes to Longstreet and to Stonewall Jackson after Antietam. And obviously he's not happy with the results of the Maryland campaign. And he takes out after Longstreet and Jackson. This army has got to have an entirely new set of officers. This army has to have a new set of discipline. This army is a bunch of worthless stragglers. This army has embarrassed the cause we're supposed to be fighting for. It goes on and on and on like this.
Mhm.
And you can almost picture Longstreet and Jackson kind of rolling their eyes at each other like, my goodness, what did we do? It's funny, there's a wonderful collection of Lee's wartime correspondence that was issued in 1961 by Clifford Doughty and Lewis
Mhm.
Mannering.
Yeah.
That letter is not in that collection.
Mhm.
It's in the official records. It's not in that collection. And all right, given the way that Doughty and Mannering wanted to present Lee in that anthology, I'm not entirely surprised at that. It was a very telling omission. But that's part of the perfectionism that the man wants to promote.
Yeah.
And you see this in how he deals with subordinates all through the war. His adjutant, Walter Taylor. Walter Taylor wrote 2 books about service with Lee, and they're very worshipful books about the great man. But there's also, yes,
I
you've
have
got
one. I'm going to wave it
That's
at the
right, you've
camera
got-
while we.
right,
you talk.
right. There we are, 4 years with General Lee.
Yeah.
He also writes letters during the war to his fiancee, which were subsequently published by the University of South Carolina Press as Lee's Adjutant. And in these letters, there's sometimes a very different Lee who emerges there. Taylor, working as Lee's adjutant, says, I've never worked for someone who was so unappreciative, so demanding, who just treats you like there's nothing that he's going to give you a compliment for. It's very frustrating to work for General Lee. That's not quite the Lee who appears in the 2 memoirs, but it does indicate that what you're dealing with is a Lee who was a perfectionist.
Yeah.
Charles Marshall, in his memoir, an aide de camp of Lee's, which was not published until the 1920s, Marshall handled the outgoing correspondence for Lee, whereas Taylor handled the incoming. Marshall would draft documents for Lee. Lee might have loved to write personal letters, but didn't like to write official stuff. So he put a lot of the official letter writing in Marshall's hands. Marshall said he would write this, and then Lee would go through it word by word by word correct this, correct that, challenge this, challenge that. It was like he wasn't a general. He was a fact checker.
Yeah.
And and Marshall was halfway implying that this could be a very onerous job because Robert E. Lee would micromanage everything that Marshall wrote for him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, perfectionism.
Perfections. Hey, you started talking about the war, so this brings us to the war. And Alan, we do have a number of questions from the folks who are watching. So my brilliant questions are probably not going to get treated here, but I definitely want us to interact with our customers, because we have some people that are good customers, and they have some great questions. I'm going to move through them fairly quickly, and some of these questions are maybe from the 10,000 or 20,000 foot section, so maybe they don't need. We'll let you see what you want to say, but there are also some ones that I think are going to pique some interest in you and make you want to talk about them. Dave Wiegers is watching here from Illinois, and he was very happy with your Hollies reference early on, Midas in reverse. So that's
that's the classicist in me peeking out.
Mike Berkheimer is watching.
Oh, hello, Mike. All right.
Yeah, and he does want to know, was there ever an overreaction panning Lee's generalship as a way of refuting the lost cause, as per Ed Bonekemper and Alan Nolan? Mike, I want to talk with Alan about that toward the end of our program when we bring Tom Connolly back into the conversation. So I think you're going to get a chance to have that addressed, the idea of overreaction to the lost cause narrative. James Conroe asks, if Lee had remained loyal to the Union, as did his fellow Virginian, General George H. Thomas, would thousands have died as Lee wouldn't have helped end the war early as the head of the Union Army?
Well, let me speak to that, because that is actually something of an unknown. Let's suppose for a moment that Robert E. Lee had accepted the offer that was made to take command of federal field forces.
I think this is what James is getting at.
Yeah. It's hard to predict, because Lee's first command as a Confederate senior officer was in West Virginia in the late summer and fall of 1861. And the results of that campaign were pretty mediocre. Mm-hmm. The one significant battle that emerges out of that campaign at Sheet Mountain is a model of lack of coordination. Now, granted, Lee was working against the terrain. He was working with very uncooperative material, and yet Robert E. Lee is not able to overcome that. If Robert E. Lee had been the man who took charge of federal forces at the outbreak of the war, instead of, let's say, Irvin McDowell, mm-hmm. If Robert E. Lee had commanded a federal army marching down to Bull Run, would Robert E. Lee have done better than McDowell? The campaign in West Virginia suggests that he might not have. And in fact, Robert E. Lee, after a possible defeat at Bull Run, might have gone on the shelf as readily as McDowell did. And that might be the context in which we think of Robert E. Lee.
McDowell had a dull weapon. Whether he was good or bad, he had a dull weapon.
Right. So it's difficult to say, simply because the record for Lee is itself ambiguous. Lee does not become, you might say, Robert E. Lee until the victories that he wins in the Peninsula Campaign. Mm-hmm. Before that, people have their serious doubts about Robert E. Lee. First of all, they have some doubt about his commitment to the Confederacy. And what's more, they have some doubt about whether he's going to be an active commander, because as an engineer, all he seems interested in doing is digging trenches and building fortifications. So they call him the King of Spades. Right. They call him Granny Lee. It's really not until we get to the Peninsula Campaign, when he takes over for Joe Johnston, that suddenly Lee is able to move forward, achieve these marvelous successes in the 7 Days Battle, then at Second Bull Run. That's when he becomes the General Lee that we most often are thinking of when we think of Robert E. Lee.
Right. Which brings us to another question from Mike Berkheimer. And this one is more direct to this part of the war. So Mike asks, did the scholarship of the late Joseph Harsh, who dug deep into the Antietam campaign, give you a more positive view of the generalship of Lee and McClellan in the Antietam campaign?
Certainly did of Lee, because there are a number of treatments of the Maryland campaign which ask questions out loud, like, well, why did Lee do this? Was it not reckless of Lee to throw his army across the Potomac when it seemed clearly unprepared to do so? Was the stand he made at Sharpsburg a foolish piece of bravado? These are the kinds of questions that have been asked about Lee on the Maryland campaign. Harsh's two books on the Maryland campaign, I think, go a large way towards dispelling that. And I put a lot of stock by Harsh's writings that way. I think his interpretation of what goes on in Maryland in 1862 is definitely an authoritative guide for anyone who wants to understand Lee in Maryland. And I think in particular, why does Lee make the stand he makes at Sharpsburg? Because he's keeping open still the possibility that he might be able to slip away from the grip of George McClellan and continue the invasion that he had planned up into Pennsylvania. So I think what Harsh wants us to see there is a Lee who is calculating, a Lee who is planning another jump, and who is hoping that McClellan will be McClellan and that the Confederates can bluff him into stalemate, allowing Lee, with his army now reconcentrated from Harper's Ferry, pursuing its campaign up through Hagerstown up into Pennsylvania. That, of course, is what he does a year later in 1863.
Right. Now, those are the questions that we have thus far. And if you have questions, I'm going to look at the questions again, folks, before we get to the end of the program here, but we are coming up on it before too long. But in terms of war writing, while this book does cover the entire war and it covers it very well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you see two episodes in the summer of 1862 that most accurately reflect this character of Lee that we've spent most of our time today talking about. One is the 7 days.
Yeah.
You seem to think that the 7 days is the real masterpiece, the
Yes.
real beginning of Robert E. Lee as the great general. But then the second one is that Special Orders 191. I think to you, it's not really just a random mistake. I think it means something about this guy's leadership. Do I see it? Am I reading that right?
Oh, well, you're definitely reading it right.
Yeah.
Let me deal with the first of those. When Jefferson Davis turns to Robert E. Lee, that was not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. There were a number of other people Davis might have turned to. He might have left the Army of Northern Virginia in the hands of Gustavus Smith. Why not? Smith had a long career in the U.S. Army. He'd been with Lee in Mexico. He had as much that way to talk about in terms of leadership as anyone else. We could have turned to John Bankhead Magruder. We could have turned to we could have turned to Benjamin Huger. I mean, there are a number of people Davis could have turned to. Instead, he turns to Lee. And when Lee takes command, it's almost like a light switch is thrown. People up to this point, including Joe Johnston, right up until the Battle of Seven Pines, are talking in terms of retreat, 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 retreat. The McClellan juggernaut is not to be resisted. We're going to have to abandon Richmond. The numbers are against us, so on and so forth. And Lee steps in and says, stop talking about the numbers. If we go to ciphering, we are already defeated. Instead, he is going to go on the offensive. He's going to pull Stonewall Jackson in from the valley, and he's going to hit what he believes is this right flank of McClellan's army hanging in midair. Why does he do this? Why Lee doing this? I think the answer is buried back in his experience in the Mexican War. Because in the Mexican War, he's attached to the staff of Winfield Scott. And more than just being attached, Scott has a terrific eye for talent. Scott almost makes him his principal aide during the campaign up to Mexico City. And one lesson above all that Robert E. Lee learns from Winfield Scott in Mexico is the principle of the continuous offensive. Even if the numbers are against you, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving, keep the enemy off balance, constantly use that initiative to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that's what will be rewarded with success. Well, that's exactly what he does in the 7 days.
Yeah.
He does at Winfield Scott. He launches this attack at Mechanicsville, then another at Gaines Mill, and then all through the series. And George McClellan behaves as though someone has hit him over the head with a 2x4. Like, oh, I was not expecting this. I'm seeing stars. And executes this reconcentration back at Harrison's Landing. It's remarkable. And all the more remarkable for the fact that George McClellan had been in Mexico too, along with Scott. Evidently not really picking up much. He didn't get the memo. But Robert E. Lee is different. Lee does the Winfield Scott thing. And that model for the continuous offensive is a model Lee employs over and over and over again as a strategist, moving through the campaigns of 1862, 63. He would have tried to have done it even in 1864 if Ulysses Grant had permitted him. So there's a lot of this which is bound up with the fact that Lee has learned the lesson of the continuous offensive and learned it from Winfield Scott. What he didn't learn was how not to lose campaign orders. And that's what you get with General Orders number 191. Mm-hmm. General Orders number 191. Walter Taylor once said that this was as close as you could get to seeing the finger of God intervening in history. Because as far as Taylor was concerned, the loss and then the discovery of General Orders 191 the
lost order, if anybody out there is,
it completely changes the complexion of the Maryland campaign.
Yeah.
And there's a certain sense in which that's true. No one has ever yet been able successfully to pin blame for who lost those orders. And there are elaborate skeins of logic about it. Mm-hmm. Everyone's been figured, from poor Daniel Harvey Hill, to whom it was addressed, even to Jeb Stuart. I've heard Jeb Stuart blamed that way. I've heard Kid Douglas being blamed as the person who lost the orders. There's any number of nominees for who lost the orders. But the fact is, the orders got lost. The question that's always lingered in my mind is, were they really lost? Was this not so much carelessness as an intelligence moment? And this is something I want to explore in some greater detail. There's a new book which is going to be coming out later this year, devoted entirely to the question about the lost orders. And like the accounts of Lee's decision to leave the United States Army, the closer you press on these accounts of the loss of the lost orders, the more various and more variations show up in where they were discovered, how they were discovered, who brought the orders to whom, where they went up the chain of command, and so on like that. It's a story that we think we know, but it's a story that the more we press on it, actually it turns out we don't know nearly as much as we think.
Right.
So that's something I want to explore in some other environments. But the lost orders, oh my goodness, they are certainly deserving of much more study than they have received, even though in truth, they've been the focus of a lot of attention. They really need more.
Right. And it sounds like they're getting them. Hey, I want to let you know we have reached the 1 hour part, the 1 hour point of our conversation. And we've covered briefly 2 of my undergraduate 3 supporting topics. If you have a few more minutes to chat, we can do that, or we can.
Let's go. Let's go for it. Let's go for it.
I want to make sure that we have that time. I don't want to press upon you for that. But the third thing, and I want to, for those of you who are asking war questions, I want to again make sure you understand that Robert E. Lee, A Life, handles the war questions quite in depth and with new perceptions of these questions. The reason why I'm aiming before and after the war is, frankly, because I found those parts of the book were the things that I didn't know. And I love reading about things I do know. It also makes because I can read the book going, aha, well, what did he say about this? What did Harsh say about this? But when I got to the parts of the book that I didn't know, those are the parts that I have to read twice, right? And so first is getting inside Robert E. Lee's skin before the war even starts. And we talked about that for a long time. And the story of the Lees and who they are brings us to those three items that you brought up that are core to his character. But when we come out of the war, he only survives a few years. And we can talk a little bit about the time at Washington and Lee, where he, as you say, he finally gets control of something. And I want to hear about that. But then also we move into this arc of storytelling, of narrative, where Robert E. Lee loses total control over who he is. And other people start fighting about who Robert E. Lee is. And that's why I've dressed the set with Douglas Southall Freeman, with Fitz Lee, the General Lee book. I have Cook here, I have Lee. You talk about a dispute in the early 19th century whether Lee was a Southerner or Lee was an American, but the one thing that they could not disagree about was he was perfect.
Yeah.
Whether talking about Bradford or someone else. And then finally, we're going to get to Thomas Lawrence Connolly, the Marble Man, and just break that down. But the first thing I want to hear about is tell us about his experience at Washington and Lee, and why do you say he's finally found something he can control?
At the end of the Civil War, there was a very good question for Lee. What is he going to do? I mean, he is a paroled prisoner. The parole that is issued by Ulysses Grant is by and large legally what protects him from an indictment for treason. There is an indictment. He is indicted for treason, but never brought to trial, and never brought to trial largely because Ulysses Grant threatened to resign as general of the army if the Johnson administration tried to put Lee on trial. For Grant, that was a point of honor. Yeah. He had given that parole to Lee. He was going to make sure it was observed. Even so, Lee understands that there's a sword hanging over his head. So in the late summer of 1865, a very unusual job offer comes his way. He had had job offers before and usually turned them down. They were for people who just wanted his name on the letterhead of an insurance company or something like that. A very peculiar job offer from the trustees of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, the upper end of the Shenandoah, where Stonewall Jackson lived. And it's odd because Washington College was a small college, Greek and Latin, classics, not much more than a finishing school for the Scots-Irish gentry of the Upper Valley. The war had treated it badly. It was broke. It had 12 students. It hardly had a pulse.
Yeah.
But the trustees make an offer to Robert E. Lee, and to everyone's surprise, he accepts. And it's all the more surprised because Lee never really saw himself as an educator. He had been approached years before about teaching at West Point, turned it down. He said, I'd never flourish in a classroom with cadets. He serves as superintendent of West Point for 3 years, from 1852 to 55, hates every minute of it because he's constantly being micromanaged by the chief engineer's office in Washington. So it's a big surprise when he agrees to become president of Washington College. Well, I think one reason that this appeals to him is it gets him as far away from Washington and the attentions of hostile viewers, and still be within the bounds of his parole. It gets him up and way, way, way out of sight and out of mind in the Shenandoah. But there's another factor here too, and that is Isaac Trimble, who had served as a general in Lee's army, writes to the trustees and congratulates them on snaring Lee as president. He says, "Don't give him much to do. He'll be a great figurehead." Yeah, right. Lee makes the trustees the figureheads. He takes over that place. His word becomes law. He revolutionizes the curriculum. He bulks up the student population to over 400. This is almost as big as the University of Virginia. He builds an endowment of $250,000, a lot of it from Northerners. Man, this general knew how to shake the apples out of the trees. But above all, he is in complete control. He tells incoming students, we have dispensed with the student rule book. All we expect is that every student shall conduct himself as a gentleman. Now, you hear that and you think, oh, isn't that sweet? Isn't that broad-minded? Isn't that open-ended? No, because what it means is Robert E. Lee is the judge, jury, and executioner of who's going to be a gentleman. What Lee achieves in those last 5 years of his life as president of Washington College, he gets perfectionism, because that's what he can demand of students. He gets independence, because nobody on that board of trustees is going to raise an objection to General Lee. And he gets security, because no one's going to fire him. He's Robert E. Lee. Finally, in those last 5 years, I think he gets the three forces that had gunned his life. I think they finally line up. The stars finally line up that way. I think it's almost safe to say that the last 5 years of his life were probably the happiest years of Robert E. Lee's life.
Yeah, he wasn't living under this cloud anymore.
No, and especially after Andrew Johnson issues a blanket amnesty on Christmas Day of 1868, he can call his own shots, and he's in charge. That's what makes him happy.
Well, I have one last thing I want to discuss with you, and the topic is so big we could have spent the entire time on it. That's this last epilogue chapter of your book. And to my reading, that is one of the things in this book that is different from any other previous biography that I've read. And it is a biography of Lee that tackles the question of Lee biographies. How did we get here? And the arc of that is so long, you need to buy the book and read the chapter. So I'm not going to ask you to go into John Esten Cook, and you've already talked about Taylor some and Fitz Lee. We've talked about the 20th century where the big conflict was over how perfect was he, as opposed to. Let's get to Douglas Southall Freeman, and I already showed you R.E. Lee, but we also have a copy of The Last Parade, which may be the most heroic of the Freeman publications.
Yeah.
And we have a copy of Thomas L. Connolly's The Marble Man. For Lee historiography, we might as well set up a cage match of WWE wrestlers, and in one corner is Freeman and in the other is Connolly. And while they don't actually fight each other and wrestle each other, these are two guys writing in the 20th century whose perceptions of Lee are so diametrically opposed that alone may call for a third book to reconcile them. So tell us about this. Tell us about, I want to hear about Connolly, because you've talked a little about Freeman.
Yeah.
Tell us about this, how the 20th century becomes this battleground over the Marble Man mystique and the lost cause.
In his last years, Lee was very reluctant to encourage biographers. He was very, when Thomas Rosser wrote to him proposing the raising of a Confederate monument, Lee discouraged it. And he said, this is only going to create ill feeling in the North. Don't do it. It's going to make things hard for everybody. He toys with the idea of writing a history of his own campaigns, and even just mentioning the idea, publishers started bidding for it. He never wrote it. This just was not in him. There are biographies of Lee which begin to appear even before his death. And then there are a string of shorter biographies which appear afterwards, but they tend to increasingly get sucked up into the mythology of the lost cause. Lee is not a direct contributor to the mythology of the lost cause. There are some parts of it he gives some countenance to, but he's not really an active participant in the kind of Jubal Early John Warwick Daniel version of the lost cause. It's not until after Lee's death that Lee, so to speak, is appropriated by the lost causers as the ultimate symbol of the justice of Southern chivalry. And the apex of the lost cause is what you find in Douglas Southall Freeman. I mean, his reason for finding that Lee's character is as pure and simple as the driven snow is so that he can show that the cause Lee was defending was just as pure and innocent. So if Southall Freeman's volumes are, you might say, the ultimate paean. They are the cantata of the lost cause. Go from there in the 1930s to Thomas Connolly in 1977. By the way, that spread of 40 years just shows you how compelling Southall Freeman's arguments were.
Yeah.
Connolly has a different take on Lee. Although it's not anti-lost cause. This is curious because Connolly was a Confederate historian, but he was a historian of the Confederate West.
Right.
And he was the great historian of the Army of Tennessee. And he resented the attention that was bestowed by historians on the Eastern Theater, on Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And Connolly thumped his fist on the desk and said, no, 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 that's wrong. The real war was won and lost in the West. The key army is the Army of Tennessee. Why should we celebrate the heights around Gettysburg more than the heights around Perryville? And what he wanted to do was to tear down not so much the image of the lost cause Lee. He wanted to get rid of the Virginia Lee. This Virginia virus that he felt had infected Confederate writing. In so doing, he opened the teacup crack that would allow other people to start picking apart the Lee legend, the Lee myth.
Right.
And it's from Connolly in 1977 that you can draw a bright line to, for instance, Alan Nolan in 1991 with Lee Considered, and Michael Fellman with The Making of Robert E. Lee in 2000. And these are books which gradually take on not just Lee as a Virginian, that's what Connolly was after, but the whole lost cause Lee. What they do effectively is to agree with Southall Freeman. They agree that Lee is the embodiment of the lost cause, and they dislike him for that. So they attack Lee. Basically, they're conceding that the Southall Freeman was right. My take is somewhere beyond Connolly. And Connolly has important things to point out. He is very concerned about Lee's character. He does not find Lee to be the stainless knight. But it's also beyond Nolan, and it's also beyond Fellman. What I am looking for in Lee is an essential character that explains decisions that are made. It's strange, Bjorn, to find myself as a Yankee, as I explain to people, I'm a Yankee from Yankee Land. Why am I writing about Robert E. Lee? Partly because I think I can come to it with a somewhat more distance and measured understanding of the man. Also because something in the spirit of Wordsworth, when he said, "For I have come to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, not harsh nor grating, though with ample power to chasten and rebuke." And that's what I'm looking for in Lee. I'm looking for that still sad music of humanity, which can chasten, which can rebuke, but which is still something that you find beyond the thoughtless hour of youth. I say at the very end of the book how much I owe interpretively to a literary critic, which is the great John Gardner.
Mhm.
And John Gardner made a comment in his book on writers and writing, which I think I can take as the escutcheon to place over this biography of Lee. No true compassion without will, no true will without compassion. What he meant by that was, as a biographer, as a historian, as a critic, you have to exercise the will of judgment. You must say, Lee made mistakes. Lee was wrong. Even Lee committed treason. Because anything else is just cheap, sloppy. It's not compassion. It's just cheap, sloppy messing around.
Mhm.
You have to be able to make that judgment. So no compassion without true will. But at the same time, no true will without compassion.
Yeah.
And understand the forces that made Robert Lee what he was, that drove him to be what he was, and made him this particular individual. I called this Robert E. Lee a life rather than Robert E. Lee a biography. Because really what I was after was the life, not just the biography. I wanted the
Yeah.
life. And I hope that I have achieved some measure of that.
I certainly think so, and I trust that our customers will think that as well. Thank you very much, Alan, for joining us. Thank you very much for giving us an extra 15 minutes of your time
Happy
and
to do
making a
so.
really compelling discussion. For those of you at home, you can order, and we have a link in the comments. So as soon as you're done watching this, if you're watching it live, or if you watch it later, a link in the comments to buy Robert E. Lee, A Life. And I forgot to look at the cost of it, but I'm sure we'll charge $35. And we will ship it to you. We got first edition copies, and we've had this problem. A lot of books are having this problem with the supply chain issue. These books arrived so new that they were wet. You could, I wondered if they'd send me warped books, because I could do that with them. And my colleague Sylvia Castle said, I think those might still be wet from the printer. Why don't we stack them and leave them for 24 hours? And sure enough, they were fine the next day.
Well, Bjorn, if your customers are eager to have this as an original, I have been told by Knopf that they have already gone to a second printing of Robert E. Lee Life. Excellent. So if people want to have not just the original, but they want to have the first printing, they need to move fast.
Yeah, and it has always been said, certainly by Daniel Weinberg, our mutual friend and the owner of Abraham Lincoln Bookshop, first editions are not rare, second editions are rare. Every book has a first edition.
Oh, 'tis true, 'tis
but
true.
Only a successful book has a second edition. Right. But that also means that first printings are a risk on the publisher. Yeah. So until they know that the second printing is going to sell, the first printing is going to be smaller. It's going to be a thing. Also, thank you for the signature on the custom Abraham Lincoln Bookshop. And folks at home can know that this is the result of Professor Guelzo deciding years ago to study calligraphy in order to give customers a better signature, a more handsome signature. Because certainly many of our authors simply give something that's hardly better than what you give to UPS when they're delivering your package. Hey, coming up on A House Divided, I have another announcement about the Salmon Chase biography by Walter Starr. Due to the supply chain issue, it has been delayed again. So our program with Walter Starr, scheduled for November 30th, has been delayed until February. And so February is going to be a chance when you get a chance to meet Walter Starr and get a copy of the new Salmon Chase biography. Our next definitely going to have it, House Divided, will be with John White on November 22nd. John's new book, To Address You as a Friend. And that is a book about the correspondence of African Americans to President Lincoln. On December 9th, Meg Groeling will be here with First Fallen, The Life of Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. Look at our website and and sign up for our notifications on email to know when these things are coming up. And that is going to bring us to the end of this program. Alan, do you have anything for us on Robert E. Lee, A Life before we sign off?
I think I may have strained the patience of everyone entirely too much, going on as I have. All I can say is, oh, there is a book.
Remind me what you're going to write about next. You said that. You talked about that before.
The next opus is, in fact, already in process, and it will be on Lincoln and the idea of democracy.
Wonderful. I was going to mention that before. You have decided to put one foot in Lincoln and one foot in Gettysburg, thus opening you up to abuse from both the Gettysburg fanatics and the Lincoln obsessives.
Well, if I'm boxed on both ears, that assures me I must be doing something right.
Excellent, excellent. Hey, Alan, thank you very much. Thank you to those of you watching from home, and we will see you next time right here on A House Divided.